to BCIS IR Chats. On today's episode, we focus on global terrorism and its impact to international security. Today, we have an eminent guest joining with us from United States. Let me introduce Professor Karl Kaltenthaler, who is the director of Michael J. Morell Center for Intelligence and Security Studies at the University of Akron. He is also a professor in the Department of Political Science, teaching a number of subjects, including intelligence, counterterrorism, and political extremism. He is also a fellow in the Bliss Institute of Applied Politics in the University of Akron. And Professor Karl's research interests are terrorism, political extremism, national security, and intelligence. Professor Karl also focuses on research pertaining to civil and international conflicts. He has completed multiple research studies in Afghanistan, Iran, Iraq, Kazakhstan, Tajikistan, Pakistan, Syria, and also in the United States. His work in the field has resulted in academic publications and presentations, as well as reports and briefings for the United States government. He has written and co-authored books such as ISIS in Iraq, The Social and Psychological Foundations of Terror. And he has also published multiple book chapters as well as articles in International Studies Quarterly, Political Science Quarterly, Studies in Conflict and Terrorism, as well as in multiple other journals. So, Professor Karl, I warmly welcome you to the BCIS IR Chats, organized by Research Division of BCIS. Thank you so much for accepting the invitation. And without any further ado, I would like to delve into our conversation. So, my first question.
First of all, let me say thank you for having me. It's an honor. Yeah.
And it's a pleasure actually having you. And I'm really sorry that I have to wake you up in the morning for this conversation.
That's okay. I get up around this time anyway.
Okay. So my first question is based on terrorism and its trends. So in the present context, terrorism activities from various violent non-state actors, including Islamic State, which is also known as the ISIS, and Al-Qaeda are increasing in the regions such as Sahel in Africa. Also concerns raised about IS Khorasan province's potential attacks in abroad. So within such situation, could you please elaborate on the current trends of global terrorism and how these trends are affecting international security?
So it's a great question. It's a very important question because I think a lot of people wrongly concluded that when ISIS lost its physical caliphate in Syria and Iraq, 2018, 2019, that was the end of it, that global terrorism would no longer be a significant problem. At that time, Al-Qaeda was on its heels. It was not anything like it had been under the leadership of Osama bin Laden. Even though, eventually Al-Qaeda was able to regain a foothold in Afghanistan, we still haven't seen major Al-Qaeda plots executed abroad. Having said that, though, the terrorism scene is fraught today, and it's fraught for a number of reasons. But if I was to generalize, probably the single biggest reason why terrorism is on the uptick around the world is bad governance. And what we see is that there are multiple countries where the governments are simply not providing for their people, either in a physical fashion, jobs, security, that kind of thing, but also not providing them in the sense that their citizenry feel that they're people who matter to the government, that they're people that the government think deserve their attention and their efforts. And so you get this sense of kind of humiliation, this sense of I don't matter to you, so why should I follow what you say? which is leading to more and more, particularly young men, turning to alternatives. And some of these alternatives are extremist movements and violent extremist movements. So I'd say that's kind of issue number one that's driving this. Another thing that's driving it is that to a great degree, the international coalition that had been there to defeat terrorism has to a great extent wound down. And that's caused by many different things. It's caused by domestic politics. It's caused by governments no longer cooperating with those international forces the way they once had. And so this is giving violent extremist groups more room to raise funds, to train their people, and to engage in various types of kinetic operations. So it's really those two main factors that are driving this, but it is something I would say that should be a concern to many governments around the world, because this doesn't stay within the borders of the countries that are producing these people. This is something that we know. You know, there's some countries that become terrorist incubators and terrorist exporters, and so these people end up moving from where they may have been radicalized into other parts of the world to carry out their attacks.
Excellent. Right. So my second question actually is related to your answer. So my second question is, why do you think that terrorism efforts like Operation Inherent Resolve, which is actually celebrating the 10th anniversary in 2024, are sufficient or are insufficient in addressing global terrorism trends despite ongoing activities by terrorist networks like ISIS and Al-Qaeda? Do you think that the counterterrorism measures which have been now implemented, are they sufficient or insufficient?
Right. So it depends on how you look at what the right mix of counterterrorism strategies and tactics should be in any particular area of operations. So it's not kind of a one-size-fits-all solution to the terrorism problem. You know, counterterrorism strategies really need to be molded to the particular region and the particular problem set that's in that region. If I was to use the example of Operation Inherent Resolve, it's been very successful. It was extremely successful in degrading ISIS in Syria and Iraq. But the issue there is that two things that have really kind of made their mission more difficult. One thing is that while the political sources of that terrorism, social sources of that terrorism, even psychological sources of that terrorism that bred ISIS fighters in Iraq, those have largely been solved. So Iraq is much less of a problem than it used to be. So the supply of extremists from Iraq is minuscule compared to what it was, say, 2013, 2014, 2015, even into 2016. So that makes the counterterrorism problem set a lot easier to handle when you've got less extremists who are being produced. And the ones who are taken off the playing field, so to speak, they're not being replaced the same way they once were. That's particularly true of the command authorities within these extremist organizations. Syria, on the other hand, is a totally different problem. In Syria, the political, social, psychological factors that drove ISIS's growth and breakout to be the foundation of its physical caliphate, they're all still there. Those factors didn't go away. So what happened was that you had this international coalition, principally led by the United States, in the air and then with some special operations forces on the ground, in conjunction mostly with the Kurds, was able to physically defeat the ISIS caliphate. But none of those underlying political, social, psychological factors were fixed. And the reason for that is because you've got two really intractable problems. One is Bashar al-Assad is still there. He's still a leader that the Sunnis in that area fear. And many of them, and we see this in the data that my team collect, there are Sunnis in Syria who don't like ISIS, but they prefer ISIS to Bashar al-Assad because they feel safer under ISIS than they do under Bashar al-Assad. The other problem is the Kurds. So while the Kurds have been very helpful in defeating ISIS on the ground, they've been kind of the foot soldiers of the coalition. The Kurds are still resented and distrusted by the Arab Sunni population in eastern Syria, where ISIS, central and eastern Syria, where ISIS has been most prevalent. And so, the Kurds aren't going to go away. They're going to remain there. And so for many Sunnis in this region, ISIS is the least worst option for them, mostly in terms of protecting them. And so this has given ISIS in Syria kind of new life. And if we look at what's happening in Syria with the uptick in attacks and more, we know there are more fighters on the ground than there used to be, this kind of thing. Operation Inherent Resolve is desperately trying to contain the situation now. It's not about degrading ISIS anymore. They're trying to contain a breakout. And one of the things that could be very troubling down the line is if an American president comes along and says, okay, we're trying to reduce our footprint overseas. Let's pull our people out of Syria. It's a small contingent of American forces in Syria, but it has a very important role to play. Because, it's lots of very competent American special operators, regular soldiers who are there, who help in the fight against ISIS. If they're withdrawn, it would be a very, very big problem. And it could happen. It definitely happen that they get withdrawn. So, I would definitely not say that the ISIS problem in Syria and Iraq is solved. Definitely better in Iraq than in Syria, but Syria could be a situation where we get a real resurgence of ISIS.
Okay, so in that sense, can you explain the importance of intelligence in countering terrorism? And are there any successful intelligence operations in dealing with counterterrorism, Doctor?
So intelligence is absolutely key to counterterrorism. It's hard to imagine successful counterterrorism operations of any kind that aren't intelligence, by actionable intelligence. And part of it is you need to be able to locate the enemy. Where are the terrorists? You need to know their numbers. You need to know their support base. You need to know where they're getting their funding. You need to know what kind of weapons that they have. There's so many things that you need to know. What's their next set of targets going to be? Because you can't be everywhere at once doing everything, right? You have to be able to distribute your resources such that you're efficient and effective at defeating the enemy. So intelligence is huge in a counterterrorism fight. If we, for example, look at the defeat of ISIS in Syria on the battlefield, that was largely intelligence driven. That was not just a fight where local fighters who were part of the anti-ISIS coalition just ran into ISIS and destroyed them, or aircraft that were flying around would find ISIS fighters and would destroy them. It was almost all, to a degree, intelligence driven. So some intel came into the process to be able to engage those targets. The things that I would say that are most important in intelligence collection when it comes to counterterrorism, it depends too on what the terrorist target looks like. But in the case of a group that's got some conventional warfare characteristics like ISIS in Iraq and in Syria. Imagery intelligence, so intelligence is collected from either satellites or aircraft. They can say, okay, here's where we see they are. That's important. Signals intelligence, the intercepting their communications is so important. That has been something that I don't think the public in general realizes how important that is, because it allows the collectors to know so many different things that they need to know about their targets. Who are they? Where are they? What are they planning? But so importantly, the signals intelligence allows us to know where these people are, even if we can't capture it through imagery intelligence, or what's now known as geospatial intelligence. Signals intelligence helps us do that. So I can think about multiple operations where you had counterterrorism officials from different countries cooperating based on signals intelligence to go grab ISIS leadership. And then once you grab the leadership and you get a hold of their phones, then you can go grab other people. And so it becomes kind of this domino effect thing. And so signals intelligence is really, really important. The third collection discipline that's really, really key. Without this, it's very difficult to manage any kind of counterterrorism operation. Doesn't matter if you're fighting ISIS or Al-Qaeda or whatever brand of terrorist, you need human sources. Human is so important. People that are giving you tips. Where are the terrorists? Who are the terrorists? What are they up to? That kind of thing. And not necessarily people who are in the organizations who are giving you information, but people who are in the surroundings who notice things, giving tips. Maybe they're persistent human sources, that kind of thing. Not just they give one tip and that's it. That is huge. And so if I think, for example, about the physical destruction of the caliphate in ISIS in Iraq and in Syria, human intelligence, signals intelligence, imagery intelligence, but particularly human intelligence was absolutely crucial in the defeat of that physical caliphate. And one of the things that ISIS did to their detriment was that they abused the local populations. So rather than govern with a gentleness or centric in their governance, they were brutal. They were arbitrary in how they engaged in justice in their minds. And so it turned the local populations against them, and the local populations then became, to a great extent, human sources that were able to be utilized then in counterterrorism operations. And so this is key. It's not just terrorism, guerrilla warfare depends on this too. Anytime you've got a weaker force that's trying to survive within the population against some stronger conventional force, if that population turns against them, they're almost inevitably going to lose that conflict. Because the local population, the most important thing they'll do then is give intelligence to the counter-terrorist forces.
Okay, interesting, because it actually reminds me of something I learned from one of the doctrines of Mao Zedong. He actually said insurgents are like fish in a pond. So
Exactly.
yes, so if you actually take out the water, eventually they're going to die, because
Yes.
the population is no longer, if the population is no longer with them, of course they're going to ultimately not have a win, the win that they're actually looking for. So yes, in that case, yeah.
Yeah. It's funny you bring up Mao, because I was thinking about the same thing, and I almost wanted to mention the same quote. But the logic of it is just so apparent when you look at these cases of either insurgents or insurgents that use terrorism that then get labeled as terrorists. They depend on the public, and the public is a force multiplier for them, or the public can be the end of them if the public turns against them. And so it's interesting to me how some of these groups have learned these lessons and some just can't figure it out. And for ISIS, it's really amazing to me, given that, ISIS had experience with this, because back when ISIS was Al-Qaeda in Iraq in 2016, the local Sunni population turned against them because they were too brutal to the local Sunni population.
Of
And it's one
course.
of the reasons why ISIS in Iraq was essentially defeated.
Mm.
And then you'd think, excuse me, this was 2007. So 2015, 2016, you see the same thing happen in Iraq, where the Sunni population turns against them. So 2006 happens, then again, 2015, 16, 17, again.
Yes. So when you talk about counterterrorism, I think it doesn't always flow like a river, and like it's not always smooth, and you cannot actually expect certain results the way that you want to achieve it from
Mhm.
the forces side. So in that case, Professor Karl, can you explain a little bit about the challenges that the counterterrorism, operations face in the ground?
So operations that they face, or problems that they face in their operations on the ground. One is, I'll just go back to what I was just saying. Um, it's frequently very difficult to attract useful human sources in the counterterrorism battle. And part of that is because the potential human sources may be biased in favor of the
Mm.
terrorists, because maybe they share some important social characteristic. They're of the same religion, same ethnicity, whatever it is. And those who are involved in the counterterrorism operations, maybe they're from a different ethnicity or language group or religion. And so that's an uphill climb for the people who are engaged in counterterrorism. Another thing that is very difficult is to avoid what people would call collateral damage. So in other words, you engage in counterterrorism operations without harming those that are innocent. And I'm not simply talking about if you have a bombing mission that you don't hit people with your ordnance, but even if you're arresting people who you suspect of terrorism and you end up arresting someone who's not part of a terrorist network or the movement, you arrest that person, you can make them into an enemy. And they then go to the terrorists because they want revenge. We saw this in Iraq a lot. With the sweeps that were done in Iraq by the Iraqi police and by American forces in 2004, 5, 6, 7, lots of people got swept up, lots of people got put into prison because they kind of fit the mold of an insurgent. Um, and some of your audience will know this, some may not know this, but a lot of those people ended up becoming ISIS because they were in prison together. And they particularly Camp Bucca became the camp where ISIS really was incubated. And many of those guys, like I said, they were not terrorists. They got caught up in these sweeps. And we saw this in Afghanistan too, to counter Al-Qaeda missions, or in Pakistan with the drone strikes, where you get innocent people who get hit in these strikes, and it creates a sense of anger, and people want revenge. So that's a very difficult thing, to be surgical enough in your strikes, kinetic strikes, or your police operations, where you're arresting individuals or you're questioning individuals, that you're not creating more enemies than before you started those operations. I think that's a very difficult. If we think about the United States or other countries that are involved in these counterterrorism missions abroad, is maintaining public support. Because oftentimes I don't think the public's perceive the threat as acute enough to warrant these long-run operations overseas. You know, we've seen the American public tire of keeping American forces in the Middle East. We saw it in Afghanistan. They basically said, we're done, we're tired, we want out. And the United States left, and now we see Al-Qaeda reconstituting in Afghanistan. And, you know, ISIS-K has grown in Afghanistan. Like I mentioned earlier in your podcast, there's a fear that this will happen in Syria and Iraq as well, that the United States withdraws. You know, and we've seen it also in the Sahel. I don't want to get into that yet because I know that's a question coming, but where people say, why are we in Africa? Why does this matter? What's the big deal here? And so if you don't have that public support for these missions, it makes it difficult to maintain them over time.
Okay, my next question is on technology. So, since the technology has always been essential to activities of terrorist organizations, the idea of terrorist groups using it is not new. However, some terrorist organizations are already considering the benefits of these technologies, especially in the light of artificial intelligence coming up. And there is a big hush-hush about how the technology is going to be used by the terrorist organizations in future. So in such context, how has technological advancement has stimulated the spread of terrorism in the current context?
So technological advancement has been so important in the development of terrorism for decades, in fact, centuries, if not millennia. Technology has given tools and means to terrorists to engage in attacks that wouldn't have been possible in the past. But it's very importantly given them tools to propagate their message and to gain support and to gain recruits. And to me, this is one of the things that I find most disturbing about technology now. Certainly, there are weapons technologies that have proliferated among terrorist groups that are worrying. Biological technologies, chemical technologies, radiological, nuclear technologies, which could give us a whole new type of terrorist attack that we really need to be concerned about. But for me, the most immediate problem is the propagating effect of new technologies in terms of getting the message, the narrative out there of the extremist movements. So if we think about the internet, we think about social media, it has made it so much easier for these groups to broaden their potential audience of people to listen to what they're saying and to reach those people and draw them in. And that's nothing new. I mean, lots of people have said that the internet is a very, very useful tool for a lot of these extremist organizations. I think where AI can come in is it makes it easier to disseminate the message, but it's also easier to reality through artificial intelligence to help the terrorist organizations to get people to believe what they want them to believe. You know, so you can create illusions through AI that are very convincing that may be able to draw people in to the group because you say, look, these atrocities are happening. And maybe the atrocities never happened, but AI is able to create the image that these atrocities have happened or something else. Any number of things could be imagined. So this is very troubling to me. And one of the things that I think of, and I used to think, oh, this is down the road a few years, but I'm starting to think it's not that far down the road, is the marriage of AI with where you can get commercially available drones, you can buy them on Amazon, outfit them with weapons, and you can drive these drones remotely. We've seen it happen in the war in Ukraine. On a daily basis, this is happening. But it's not long down the road where we're going to have artificial intelligence paired with this technology, these drones, drone weapons, which is going to become a huge force multiplier, because you're not going to need somebody with a controller controlling those drones into the targets. These artificially intelligence driven drones in large numbers can overwhelm a target and its defenses. And I don't think that's long down the road that happens. It's a scenario that I know worries the Israelis. I know it worries the United States. It's not just nation states that can do this, and we know nation states can do it now. Some of the more sophisticated militaries of the world, but it's not too long coming that terrorist organizations, the more sophisticated ones with cash, will be able to do this too.
Okay, since we had a little bit on Sahel and Africa, I'm compelled to actually ask a question from you on that area. So, why do you think Africa, particularly the region of Sahel, has become a hotspot of terrorism?
The short, easy answer to that is governance. So the governance that we've seen across the countries that make up the Sahel has been almost uniformly abysmal. And when I'm talking about governance, I'm talking about just basic things like provision of education, provision of water, provision of communication, provision of roads, provision of security, which I would argue is actually the most important factor in driving what we're seeing in the Sahel, is that if the government doesn't provide security to the people who live out there in where most of the people live, which is not in the capital cities, the government's not providing security there, and there's rampant banditry, the locals are going to turn to who's going to keep them safe. And the government, not only is the government not keeping them safe, the government is also predatory. So when the soldiers and the police are out there protecting the local civilians, we find that they're shaking them down. They've got, various things set up to extract resources from the people who live there. We saw this in Afghanistan. Why did so many people turn to the Taliban when they didn't like what the Taliban stood for? We saw this also in Iraq, in the run-up to ISIS. People turn to insurgents or to, insurgents who engage in terrorism frequently because they're the ones who are most likely to keep them safe. They may think that they have a repugnant ideology. They don't want to live under their draconian rules, but at the same time, it's better to not have physical harm from either a government soldier or police officer or some bandit. And so you turn to the insurgents, you turn to the people who are saying, well, we'll keep you safe. And so this is a big reason that we're seeing this, because so many of these governments, they're so corrupt and they're so uninterested in meeting the basic needs of their people that, the people just turn to the least worst option, which is these groups like Al-Qaeda and ISIS. This is not about religion. In all of the groups that I've studied across the globe who are part of the Salafi jihadi, movement, or, think of themselves as religious terrorists, particularly in the Islamic world, very few people follow them, support them out of religious grounds. It's mostly out of the thinking, do these groups meet my needs? Do they keep me safe? Are they capable of allowing me and my kids to eat? our next meal. It's very little of it has to do with the religious draw of these groups. And so one of the things to think about is a lot of these governments basically push people into the arms of these violent extremists. And if we look at the coups that have happened in many of the countries in Sahel, they've made it worse because now they've brought in the Wagner group, or now it's called the Africa Corps in that part of the world. And those guys are also engaging in predatory behavior. So rather than keeping the people safe, they're just one more predatory actor that is making people think, okay, maybe I need to join with the local Al-Qaeda affiliate, or maybe I need to join with the local ISIS affiliate because, you know, at least they'll protect us. They won't rob us.
Okay, Professor Karl, thank you so much for taking your precious time to educate us on global terrorism and its impact on international security. Your insights are highly impressive and will inspire many individuals who want to further their studies in the field of international relations, international security, and I'm sure counterterrorism as well. So we have to also give a special thanks to our audience for being with us and also being giving their encouragement to us. And stay tuned for the next episode of BCIS IR Chats. Thank you so much.
Thank you for having me.